Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this video we're going to talk about how to use Excel VBA to find the last used row, column and cell in a worksheet. I've made this video as kind of an answer to a question that crops up a lot on some of our previous videos, where we're trying to find the last cell or the next available blank row in a worksheet. So I'm going to start with a quick little recap of using the end and offset properties to do exactly that, and then explain why those are sometimes a little bit limited. So we're going to talk about using the end property to end downwards and upwards, and in doing so we're going to talk about how you can count rows in a worksheet as well to make sure your code will work for legacy workbooks as well. We're going to talk about the effect of blank cells on the end property and why that can stop the end property from working as we intend it to, and talk about a quick way to fill in the blank cells. And then we're going to talk about a couple of more exotic ways to achieve the same sort of end results. So we're going to look at the use range of a worksheet and how that's affected by populated cells and non-populated cells. And then we'll talk about using the last cell properties, one of the special cells you can select in a worksheet, and how that's related to blank cell as well. The last part of the video we're going to talk about using the find method, which is something we've covered in previous videos as well, but we're going to use the find method to find the last populated cell in either a row or a column in the entire worksheet. So there's quite a lot to do, quite a few useful and interesting techniques here. Let's get started. I'm going to start by looking at one of the most common techniques I've used in this video series, to do with when we've got a list of data and we're trying to build the list. We want to find the next available blank row at the bottom. Now this works beautifully as long as we've got at least two rows populated with values. So here I've got a simple worksheet with a header row and some sample data, not particularly interesting data I have to admit, but nonetheless it gives us enough information to work with to find the next available blank row at the bottom. So this is essentially a three-step process. Step one is to find the top cell in the list, which is usually a known starting point. So in our case we know that it's cell B2, that's got our header value in it. Then from there I want to get to the end of the existing list. So assuming there are no gaps in the list, I'm essentially going to replicate holding down the control key and pressing the down cursor key on my keyboard, which takes me to the last available or last populated cell in that list. And then from there I want to move down one further cell to leave me in the next available blank one. So to achieve all that in VBA, let's head into the Visual Basic Editor first of all, and let's insert a new module. And then let's give ourselves a quick new subroutine called something like find next blank row. So to break this down into three separate instructions, we said that we needed to find or select the top cell in our list, which is range B2. And then from there we can go to the end of the list in a downwards direction, so we can say active cell.end, xl down, .select, and then from there we can move down one further cell and say active cell.offset 1,0 .select. And just to demonstrate that that does exactly what we want it to do, I'm going to restore down the VB editor window and then step through this sequence using the F8 key. So if I use F8 to step through, range B2.select is exactly what gets selected, then find the end of the existing list, so I end up in B3 in this case, and then offset one further cell down, that leaves me in the next blank row. Now what I've done commonly in the videos that use this technique is I've combined these three instructions into a single line of code. So just to demonstrate how that works, I'd say range b2 dot end xl down dot offset 1,0 dot select, and then that's all three instructions essentially wrapped up into a single instruction. So it's more efficient both to write and to execute that code. So let's just demonstrate that by commenting out the three lines I wrote previously. And then let's make sure I've selected a cell that isn't the one I'm about to end up in. And then if I step through, it's not much point stepping through admittedly, it's only a single instruction. But if I do execute that line, you'll see that it immediately takes you to the next available blank cell in the column we're moving down. Now as I said, I've used this technique a lot in this video series to find the next available blank row to build up a list. But whenever I've done so, I've always made sure that I'm working with a list that has at least one row of data in it, along with the header row. Now, often I get asked the question or comments pop up on the videos quite a lot saying that this line of code in particular doesn't work. And the most common reason for that is because people have started with just a header row and no data in it. So let's just show you the effects of that. If I take away the row of data, or even just in fact just the single value of 1 in column B, it doesn't really matter, but let's take away the entire row of data to simulate what a real world situation might be. And then if I go back to the VB editor, and as soon as I attempt to run this subroutine, it will fail immediately with a runtime error. there's not much point in clicking debug because there's only one single line which could have gone wrong at that point. It's the only line in the entire procedure. So what's actually going on there? Well, this is probably easier to describe if I go back to using 3 separate instructions. So let's just comment out the single instruction and uncomment the 3 that I commented out earlier. And if I step through this time, if I find range B2 select, that's fairly obvious what that's going to do, and then end XL down. Now when there's no data below cell B2, or the one that I'm in at the moment, the active cell, then there's nothing to stop the selection falling all the way down to the very bottom of the worksheet. 1,048,576 rows down. The next instruction says move 1 cell further down from where I am currently, the active cell. And of course there aren't any more rows to move down to, so that's the point at which we generate the runtime error. So what can we do to solve that problem? Well, first of all, let's end that procedure. Let's head back up to cell A1 and then let's go back to the VB editor and think about ways we could get around this issue. One simplistic way to get around this problem is to, rather than start at the top of the worksheet and go downwards, start at the bottom of the worksheet and go upwards instead. So if we know that we're in column B, and that's where our first column of data is going to be, then rather than referring to cell B2, we could say range B 1,048,576, and then from there we can say end XL up rather than end XL down. Now what that would do is take us up to the first populated cell moving upwards in the upwards direction, and then from there, wherever I end up, I want to move 1 cell further down from there. So from that point, if I use the F8 key to step through, we'll start at the bottom of the worksheet, end XL up, and then offset 1 cell further down. So even if there's no data in the list, then it takes me to the next available blank row. Just to prove that it does indeed work when there is data in the list, let's just fill in some quick boring data again. And if we go back to the VB editor and step through that subroutine again, down to the bottom of the sheet, end XL up, 1 cell further down, I'm in the next available blank row. And of course again you can combine those 3 instructions into a single one, so if I just copy the cell reference rather than type it out again, and then end XL up rather than down, and then of course uncomment that line of code and comment out the previous 3. If I just execute the entire subroutine, making sure I start in a different cell just so you can see something happening, and then run it, I'll end up in the next blank row. Now one time when this can be an issue is if you find yourself still having to support legacy workbooks in the old XLS format. Prior to XL 2007, the maximum number of rows in a worksheet wasn't 1,048,576, it was only 65,536. So if I try to refer to this cell in a legacy version of Excel, then of course that's not going to work. Now one short simple solution here I suppose is we could say range B 65,536 and then end XL up. But in a modern version of Excel, if I've already used that number of rows, then this technique isn't going to do us any good whatsoever. So, what can we do to solve that problem? One relatively simple solution isn't to worry about specifying the exact number of rows on the worksheet. We can actually find that piece of information out by using a property of the worksheet itself. So rather than saying this, range B1048576, we could instead use the cells property. So I'm going to say cells and then open some parentheses. Now, again, we've covered this in a previous video, but the cells property essentially lets you specify the row number and the column number of a cell you want to reference. So in this case, what I would say is to find the number of the row, I would say something like active sheet .rows.count. And that will calculate, in this case, in this particular workbook, 1,048,576. But in a previous version of Excel, in a legacy workbook with the XLS format, it would be 65,536. The column number that I want to specify here is column number 2, because I know that I'm in column B. And then if I simply, rather than type it all out again, just copy and paste the rest of that line of code, so I end XL up, and then offset 1 cell further down, and then finally select that cell. So again, if I comment out that line and make sure that I've selected a different cell in the worksheet just to prove that this does indeed work, and then execute the entire thing, I'll find myself once again in the correct next blank row, and that's either with or without rows of data in the list. Now all of these techniques work fine so far as long as we can guarantee that column B is always fully populated with values, so every single row of data has an ID number associated with it. If you're in the situation where you've got gaps in a list, or potentially have gaps in the list, then you need to think of a different solution. So let's just simulate some data that might have some gaps in it. So let's have another ID number, and we'll say another really interesting bit of data, DF456, and then the next row we won't bother putting an ID number in, and we'll have GHI, and maybe we'll leave the number blank this time, and perhaps the next one will have a new value. Let's have ID number 3, and then we'll have JKL, and maybe leave the number out again, and then perhaps leave MNO, and then put a number in this time. What should we go for? 789, and then for the last row, actually we'll just leave it at that. So we've got a bunch of gaps in the list, some blank cells in both columns B and D. Now, one valid technique to solve this sort of a problem is to first of all populate all the blank cells in the region of data with dummy values. It could be a value like -1, which you wouldn't ordinarily see appear anywhere in the list, or it could be a literal word, like literally the word blank or the word null, something along those lines. So there's a technique in VBA that allows you to select just the blank cells in a region of data. Let's have a quick look at how we can do that. Back in the VB editor, let's have a new quick subroutine which we'll call something like fill in blanks. So the starting point for this is referring to the entire region of cells in which our list sits. So there's a quick simple technique you can use to do that. If I refer to the top left hand cell, or indeed any populated cell anywhere in my list, but range B2 seems like a sensible obvious choice because we can sort of guarantee that's always the start of our list, there's a property of a cell called current region. And if I say current region.select and then simply execute that subroutine, you'll find that it selects the entire block of cells. It's kind of the equivalent of clicking into a cell in a list in Excel and then pressing Ctrl-A, the keyboard shortcut for select all. It selects the complete region of data up until the next completely blank column and completely blank row, all the way around the block. Now in this case, of course, it's not the entire region of cells we want to select, it's just the blank cells within it. So instead of saying current region.select, what we can do instead is say current region.special cells. Now there's a whole range of different special cells using the special cells method you can select. In this case I'm going to refer to, if I open a set of parentheses, I'm going to look for Excel cell type blanks. And if I were to do that and then say .select and then execute this subroutine again, you'll find that this time it selects only the blank cells in that region of cells. The final thing we do then, rather than just selecting the cells, is we'd probably change their values in some way. So let's say rather than select at the end of this statement, we'll say .value equals, if I can spell value properly, and then we could put in a literal word or a number. Let's put something like, let's put the literal word blank. And this time, if I just make sure that I haven't selected any cells in the worksheet, and then just so you can prove this works without selecting things, and then run the subroutine again, we should find this time that all the cells that were previously blank now have the literal word blank in them. So this would solve the problem of not being able to select the next completely blank row. If I do indeed go back to the find next blank row routine and then run that one, I'll find that it does indeed end up on the next completely blank row of the table. But there are legitimate reasons why you might not want to fill in your blanks. You might not want to mix and match data types, for instance. So this sort of catch-all approach where you just blanket fill everything with the same word or the same numeric value, like -1. You might have dates in one column and numbers in another and text in another, and you may legitimately not want to mix and match those data types. So let's take things back to the way they were before. Sadly I can't undo that because you probably well know you can't undo what a piece of VBA code does. So let's just undo that manually, and let's think about a couple of different solutions we could use. One possibility we have here is to refer to the used range of a worksheet. So just to demonstrate what that is, let's create a new subroutine called something like select used range. And to do that, what you have to do first of all is reference an entire worksheet. So I could say active sheet, or in this case I'm going to use, because it provides me with the IntelliSense, I'm going to use the code name of the worksheet, which currently is called sheet 1. You'll always be able to tell the code name of a worksheet. It's the one that's not in parentheses in the Object Explorer, the Project Explorer, in the top left hand corner. So if I say sheet 1 dot used range dot select, If I were to do that and then execute the subroutine, I'll find that it selects, essentially, in this case it's the equivalent of the current region, because I've got a single table of data. But if I had something like another region of data somewhere further down, let's say if I added in a totals or a total cell further into the worksheet, and I said in here equals sum, and then referred to something like that block of cells. So even though there are gaps in this list here, if I said current region, that would be the equivalent of that block of cells. If I say use range and execute that, then you'll find that it's actually the entire range of used cells on the entire sheet. Now, if I delete that total and that sum function that I've added in there, and then just go back and then execute this select use range routine again, I'll find that it goes back to selecting just the table of data that's populated. So the use range is just the cells that are populated at the time. Now this may not seem massively useful just yet to achieve our ultimate aim of selecting the next available blank row in our list, but we can use the use range to calculate the next available blank cell. So to do that, we need to rely on the fact that rather than just selecting the entire use range, we can refer to individual cells within it. So if we say sheet1.userange.cells, this is the same cells property we looked at earlier on, where you can specify the row number and the column number, but in this case it's just the row number and the column number within the use range. So for instance, if I said row, let's say row 3, comma, column 1, and then close the parentheses and said dot select, then what this will do is refer to row 3, so that's 1, 2, 3, column 1, column B in this case, in just this block of cells. So I'll end up with cell B4 selected. So if I were to execute that, that's indeed the cell that I end up with. So having established that, what I can now do is replace the number 3 with something that calculates the last row in the use range. It's fair to say I could do this in a similar way using the current region. I can refer to the cells property of the current region, but again, as I said before, the used range refers to the entire used range of the worksheet. Even if there are gaps in this list, and we had some more data further down, this would refer to the complete used range rather than current region, which is just the single continuous table. So let's say rather than the number 3 here, I'm going to replace that by saying sheet1.usedrange.rows.count. So that tells me the total number of rows, which in this case it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then if I were to run that subroutine, I'll end up with the last row, the first column of the last row selected. Then all I would need to do from that point is move one cell further down to end up in the next completely available blank row. So let's just insert that before the dot select. We'll say dot offset 1, 0 dot select. So once again, running the entire thing in one go, if I execute the entire thing, I'll end up in what is truly the next available blank row. There's another technique that we can use with similar functionality to use range that allows us to find the last used cell on a worksheet. So in order to demonstrate that, let's have another quick subroutine called find last used cell. And then in here, so that's meant to be cell rather than cells, and in here what we're going to do is refer first of all to any cell in the entire sheet. So I'm going to refer to range A1. And then from there, this is related to the special cells method that we looked at earlier on. So if I say special cells and then open some parentheses, another one of the special cells we can refer to is the XL cell type last cell. So if I say XL cell type last cell and then say dot select at the end, and if I were to execute that subroutine, I'll find that it's the last populated cell in the worksheet that's currently selected. Now there are a couple of slightly more unusual things about the last cell. First of all, it might not actually refer to a cell that has had a value stored in it. So just to demonstrate that, let's add a couple of extra rows in the ID column. Let's have 4 and 5 in the list. And if I were to go back to the VB editor and execute this instruction again, we'll find that it's not a cell that's actually got a value in it that's considered the last cell. It's one in the last populated column in the last populated row. This behaviour extends to columns as well. So if I were to add in a new column heading in the worksheet, let's say date, I won't actually bother putting any date values in there. But if I were to go back to the VB editor again and execute this single instruction, we'll find that it's the last populated cell, or sorry, the last cell in the last populated column and last populated row that's selected. One other unusual thing is that the last cell remembers cells that were previously populated but were subsequently cleared. So again, just to demonstrate that, let's pick a random cell somewhere further down and enter a dummy value into it. And then if we were to go back to the VB editor and execute this single instruction, we'll find that it is, of course, that cell that gets selected. But if I then subsequently clear the contents of that cell and head back to cell A1 and then execute that instruction again, we'll find that it's the same cell, even though it's now blank, that gets selected. This is slightly different to the used range. We saw that the used range, as soon as you clear the contents of cells, then the used range sort of collapses and shrinks back to just the populated cells. But the last cell doesn't. Now there are a couple of ways you can clear this last cell. It's sort of, this cell is considered dirty at this point. I think that's the correct terminology. So what we can do to clear that is we can save the workbook, or we could close the workbook down and reopen it, of course. But the simplest thing to do is just to save the workbook. If I hit the save button either in the VB editor or in Excel itself, then were I to execute that same subroutine one more time, we'll find this time that the last used cell is once again the last cell in the last populated column and the last populated row. Okay, just to wrap up the video then, let's say you were in a situation where there was a specific cell you wanted to find. So unlike the last cell, which it could well be a blank cell in a column or a row with values in it, let's say, for example, you wanted to find a cell in the last row that was populated, like so. Let's say we wanted to find cell C9, or indeed let's say we wanted to find the cell in the last populated column, in the actual last populated cell in the last populated column. Let's put a date in there. I'll just put today's date in a cell by pressing Control semicolon on the keyboard. Quickest and shortest way to do that. So let's say we wanted to find either of those two cells. How could we achieve that? Now this technique actually involves using the find method, and I've made a couple of videos on the find and find next methods as part of this series already, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail on the find method itself. But what I will do is show you how you could use the find method to find, let's say first of all, I want to find the last populated cell in the last used row of a worksheet. So let's have a new subroutine to demonstrate that. Let's give myself a bit more space, and let's think of a nice sensible name. Last used cell in last used row. Does that make sense? Well, that's what I'm going with anyway. I've typed it all out now. So to make this work, we've got to refer to, essentially in this case, all the cells on the worksheet. That's what we're trying to apply the find method to. So I'm going to say cells.find, and then I'm going to open up a set of parentheses, and there's a few different parameters we need to pass values into this time. First of all, the what parameter. I'm going to name these so that you can read this one hopefully a little more clearly, and in fact let's break it down across multiple different lines as well so we can read it more clearly. So I'm going to say find what equals, and what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a wildcard character, the asterisk, which essentially says find anything, any cell contents at all. So once I've done that, I'm going to type in Control space, and then I'm going to say I'm going to specify the after parameter as well. Now the after parameter allows you to refer to a range of cells, to essentially where to begin your search after. I'm going to begin my search after range A1, so I'm going to say range A1, and then another comma and a space underscore, and let's see what else. I want to specify this search order this time. Actually, I'm going to use the default search order, but I'm going to put it in here anyway just so you can see more clearly what we're doing. So I'm going to say search order equals XL by rows, then another comma space underscore. And finally what I'm going to do is specify the search direction. So I'm going to say search direction equals, and I'm going to say XL previous. So this is why I specified range A1 as the after argument. So if I say XL previous, excuse me, let me just close the parentheses there and finally say .select at the end so it actually do something useful with this. So if I say range A1 and then go to the previous cell, that will actually start searching the worksheet backwards. So the last cell the first cell that it actually searches in is cell XFD 1,048,576. So it's going to start all the way down in the bottom right hand corner of the worksheet and work its way backwards. Now it's searching by rows, so it's going to go go through all the columns in one row before it searches all the columns in the next row, and so on and so on and so on. So essentially, the first cell that it's going to encounter, searching for a cell with any value in it, should be, in our case, cell C9. So let's just give that a quick try and make sure that that works. I've got cell A1 selected, and if I just run the subroutine, I'll end up with cell C9 selected. From that example, you can probably work out how easy it is to find the last used cell in the last used column. So let's just give this subroutine a quick copy-paste, copy the entire thing, paste it in a couple of lines further down. Last used cell in last used column. We essentially only need to change one single thing apart from the name of the subroutine, of course. Rather than searching by rows, we simply want to search by columns instead. So to specify that, we say search order Excel by columns, and in this case what we should find is that cell E7 becomes selected. So once again, if I just execute that subroutine, we'll find out that it's the last used cell in the last used column that becomes selected. So, phew, quite a lot to take in there, but hopefully that's cleared up a few of the little issues, particularly the one surrounding searching for the last or the next available blank cell when your list doesn't already have any data in it. That's the main reason I made this video, to sort of answer that question. There's lots of other useful techniques you can take away from this video as well. Hopefully you're going to find some of those useful in the real world. Any questions, just post them in the video below, in the comments, and thanks for watching. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.